All right, thank you so much, everyone who's joined us today. Today we'll be talking about how to make your efforts count by leveraging iMapInvasives to record water chestnut polls. So thank you all for joining us for this iMap webinar. We're very lucky to have some guest speakers today. So we have Stephen Pearson from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. He's a research scientist. We also have Lauren Henderson, the Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator at Capital Region PRISM. And we also have myself. I am the End User Support Specialist for the Invasive Species Database Program at the New York Natural Heritage Program. And we also have Jacob Moore, who is a grad student at SUNY ESF, and he's interning with the Natural Heritage Program and the DEC. And again, so it'd be great to hear more about who we have on the call today. So please introduce yourself in the chat box with your name, and if you're part of an organization, it'd be great to see that too, and where you've done water chestnut polls or where you plan to. And so I have a couple of introductory slides. And I should also mention from the get-go, so I'll ask people to stay muted during the presentation. There will be time at the end if you want to unmute and ask questions, but you can also enter any questions you have into the chat box, which should be a little speech bubble somewhere at the bottom of your screen. So I work for the New York Natural Heritage Program. We facilitate the conservation of New York's biodiversity by providing information and scientific expertise on rare species and natural ecosystems. We're a partnership between the New York State DEC and SUNY ESF. And so while we do a lot of work with rare species, invasive species are highly impacted by, rare species and biodiversity are highly impacted by invasive species. So we also have the Invasive Species Database Program within the New York Natural Heritage Program. And so we manage the iMapInvasives database, and we work on a couple of other projects, including we run the data management portion of the Watercraft Inspection Steward Program. And for anyone new to iMapInvasives, so this is the online centralized invasive species database to support PRISMs, state agencies, and other partners working on invasive species issues. You can look at species distributions, generate reports, set up email alerts, and one thing we'll be talking about a lot today is that you can track control efforts and results. And I just mentioned PRISM, so anyone who's not familiar, New York State is divided into 8 different regions. They're called Partnerships for Regional Invasive Species Management. For instance, we have Lauren as a presenter today from the Capital Region PRISM. So if you are not yet connected with your PRISM, I highly encourage you to look up your PRISM and look at their website. There's always a lot of great information and a lot of great events run by each of the PRISMs. And so iMapInvasives is the state database for New York State invasive species, but where does all the data come from? So we partner with many, many organizations across the state. For the past, I'd say from 2010 to like 2017, some of our main data sets were pre-existing data sets from other organizations that we brought into iMapInvasives. And those were hugely valuable for getting a baseline of where invasive species are in New York State. But in recent years, really the most important data set has been people like everyone on the call today. So we rely on community scientists and professionals doing invasive species work on the ground across the state to continue reporting observations to iMapInvasives and keep our database up to date and representative of where invasive species are, since they are constantly changing their distribution. And I'll note that so anyone can report to iMapInvasives, but those records do have to be confirmed by experts, usually based on the photos submitted. And so why are we here today, and why is iMapInvasives so important when we're thinking about water chestnut? So many of you are probably familiar with water chestnut, It's an invasive species that threatens New York water bodies. Lauren Henderson will talk in more detail about all the different sorts of potential impacts that can come with water chestnut. And so one of the best options for managing these infestations in many cases is pulling them by hand. And so water chestnut volunteer pull events occur across the state throughout the summer each year. I'm sure many of you have been involved with these sorts of events. And while many organizations do track their efforts, we have found that across the state, they're not necessarily tracked in a standardized way or all in the same place. So when we're trying to think about answering questions like how many polls were conducted in each year, how effective are the polls, are they reducing abundance over time, how much biomass are we pulling up each year, we don't really have a great way of answering those questions. You can answer it for maybe a particular organization, but it's difficult to answer it all across New York State and to kind of have a really great idea of what's going on across the state. So the iMap team has been working with the PRISM network and DEC and trying to figure out how we can better handle these sorts of questions. And what we've landed on is leveraging the pre-existing database. So iMapInvasives is the invasive species database. So we're going to talk today about how we can use iMapInvasives to better and in a more standardized way collect water chestnut data across the state. And so that brings us to our next topic, which Steve Pearson will talk about, so the importance of standardized data collection. And just to give you an idea of what else is going to be in the webinar today, so after Steve, Lauren Henderson from Capital Region PRISM is going to give some background information on water chestnut and water chestnut polls, and then Jacob and I are going to talk about how to record those in iMap. So take it away, Steve.
Well, thank you, Nick. I appreciate all the work that iMap is doing with water chestnut and all the folks statewide who are doing the hands-on managing. So in terms of the benefits of using iMap and standardizing data collection across the state and more locally, there are a number of reasons that this is an important tool. So in iMap itself, just having presence and from everyday surveys, we get to look at the changes in distribution. So how is water chestnut in this particular component, how is it distributed across the state and how is it spreading? And so we can track that over time. Then in using water chestnut and our year-to-year management type activities, we can look at the changes in abundance over time. So that's when folks go back to the same sites year after year and they either manage or they survey. We can look to see how it's changing and responding to the different types of activities that are going on. On the broad scale, we can look at that across the state, so statewide, but also locally within individual sites or smaller regions like prisms or wetland complexes or something along those lines. We can look at that site-specific change in abundance. And at that scale, you can really look at how the management is working to alter the abundance over time. It's important to note that water chestnut can be controlled most readily when it's caught early. You can use this methodology of hand pulling, and you can see in the photo there, that's the results of a hand pull event that occurred on Long Island back in 2018, where folks and volunteers and staff all went out and pulled a bunch of water chestnut to reduce the abundance at that particular site. You can look at the long term. Well, it's important to note that water chestnut control is a long-term, multi-year commitment, and that's because the seed viability can be up to 12 years. So if you start to manage a site and you remove all of the water chestnut before it drops new seeds, the seeds from the previous year that those plants grew from, they could be growing for another 10 or 11 years. So you must go back year after year and remove the water chestnut that you find. And Lauren will talk more about the ecology of the water chestnut. So in terms of standardizing our tracking methods, it helps us better understand the statewide implications of having this water chestnut and what's going on. And using that standard tracking methods, we can compare methods of management, so what's working and how well is it working. We can compile data about the amount of water chestnut pulled, and these are things that Mitch mentioned earlier. Important, we can look at the amount of effort expended, both at those broad regional scales, but also site-specific. You can look at the effort that went in this year, and you can see if how that decreases over time. And we have good examples of how water chestnut can be controlled with pretty large effort in about 3 years or so, and then it can drop off significantly to just a few hours. And that just depends on the extent of your population and the intensity of effort that goes in those early years of management. And as we know, understanding how this works will help us understand invasive species management efforts statewide. Next slide, please. So in terms of submitting to iMap, it's important to build and maintain institutional knowledge. So for your particular site or your particular group, you can have those data in a centralized location, in which case, if there's turnover or additional people come on, it's easy enough to go back to those different data sets. You'll know where it is on your particular site, what kind of management occurred and when. So maybe you managed in June this year, but August the following year, and you missed the seed. So you can look at that local phenology, potentially using these data, and also look at who you need to work with to organize your individual polls. In terms of record keeping, it says here what gets measured gets done. So it's in the database, and people can follow it through time, and it's it's much easier to continue the process rather than forgetting about it from year to year. There are some really interesting components of iMap and the other tools that Mitch will talk about, but you can create polygons within iMap, and that allows you to map out the infestation sizes and also to make estimates of the distribution and how that changes through time. And then, of course, there's the reporting mechanisms within iMap and how that's reviewed by folks statewide. The figure on the right, the figures on the right, both the table, the aerial photo on the bottom and the bar chart here on top, can show how that effort, when expended early on in a management project, can really pay off for later years. And so that bar on the top is showing the amount of individual plants that were pulled over a 10-year period. And you can see that start in the years 2009 to 2011, quite a large effort was put in. So 300 to 370 hours of person time pulling those. But then by 2012, the population had crashed. And what you see there is removing all those annual plants can lead to this great reduction in water chestnut. And then every year since then, it's general maintenance on it. So a person or two, they go out 1 or 2 days a year and they pull a few plants. And so that's really a successful site. The photo on the bottom is the same site, and you can see that the water chestnut has, between 2010 and 2018, you can see all the green in the 2010 picture, has completely been diminished by 2018. Next slide. So our goal with the water chestnut poll is to remove water chestnut on a statewide level. if we can record those chestnut pools in a standardized way within a single location, so in this case, iMapInvasives, we can begin to compare across years and between years at individual sites, and then also look at management within that site and across the full state. And so these are some of the questions that we're wondering about. So how much water chestnut's removed? How is the abundance changing over time in both individual sites, but also more broadly across the state? Is water chestnut still spreading, or at some point does it begin to shrink its overall coverage?